in the book of James. So if you got a Bible with you, we're going to be in James chapter 5. James chapter 5, we've got this week and next, and then we're done with this book of James. But man, the book of James has been one of my absolute favorite books of the Bible since I became a Christian. Here's what I love about James. He just gets to the point, right? Like you read some stuff and you're going, what's the deeper hidden meaning in this book of the Bible? And James is like, don't complain against your neighbor. And you're like, what's the meaning? You go to research it, and it's like, oh, guess what that means? Don't complain against your neighbor. Pretty cool, James. Way to just put it out there for us, right? James is just straightforward. And so we're going to continue in James chapter 5 today. But I got a question for you. This requires your participation. So if this is you, I just want you to raise your hand big and proud. Don't deny it, because your neighbor will tell the truth on you, okay? So here's the question. How many of you have ever been to a place in life where you're just going, I don't know if I can take any more of this, right? Ooh, right? If you're not raising your hand, you're probably not that emotionally aware, and so you might need to seek counseling. But every single one of us get to a place where we have hit our limits, right? So maybe for you, like this morning, I don't post a ton on social media anymore, but I still like to get on and look at things, and I'll notice like, well, hey, Joe Schmo posted something pretty dumb. Guess what? They did the same thing yesterday multiple times. And you're sitting there going, I just don't know how much longer I can read what they're saying, right? Don't know how much more of it I can handle. Others of you, you have kids. And how many of you know your kids like to say the same things over and over and over and over and over and over again? And you love your kids, but you're thinking, I want to find the most polite way to tell you to shut up possible without getting in trouble, right? Because our kids, sometimes you love your kids, but man, they just get you to the point where you're experiencing your limit. Or some of us, we go to work and you just have a bad day at work, right? You just have a bad day at work, could be any number of things, and you come home and you're so agitated from work. You've hit your limit so hard from being at work that you go home, your wife or your husband or your kids or your neighbor, somebody does something that like on the level of transgressions is probably like a 3, and you react with like an 8 or a 9. Anybody ever done that before? Just me. Awesome. Thanks, guys, leaving me up here on an island. But you just overreact and you immediately know, I'm going to have to apologize, right? Like this is just what I have to do because I took it way too far. See, here's what we know. For every single person who's ever lived on the face of the earth other than Jesus Christ, to live is to have limits. To live is to have limits. None of us are Superman or Superwoman, Supergirl, whatever she's called. None of us are that. None of us can handle anything and everything that's thrown our way. We're just not designed that way. In fact, in Psalm 103, verse 14, the psalmist writes and says, God remembers that we're dust. He remembers that we are limited. We can only handle so much. And what happens is when we hit our limit, most people respond in one of 3 different ways. So the 3 ways most people respond are either fight, flight, or freeze. Fight, flight, or freeze. So to fight, this is kind of my go-to, right? So when I'm agitated and I'm feeling it, I don't hide from it, but I can get a little mean, right? Like, I want to argue with you. I want to nitpick. I get pretty judgy because what I'm doing in the moment, I'm fighting. I'm ready for it, right? Like, you already got me upset. Let's just go. Other people, you do the flight thing. So when something happens, you're having tension in your marriage or something bad happens at work, you just want to put as much space between you and that thing as possible so you just get away, right? This is why some of you, when you get in an argument at home, you're like, we're not going to talk about it right now. I'm just going to get my keys. I'm going to go to a store. Don't know if I'm going to spend money. Don't ask me. I just want to get out of the house, right? So you're all about the flight. Other people, they freeze. And this is the one that's really difficult because what they're doing in that moment is they're saying, if I just act like it's not happening, it's not happening. If I can pretend it's not there, it's not there, right? So you just freeze up in the moment because you don't have the energy or the bandwidth to fight. You don't have the energy or the bandwidth to run away. You're just kind of stuck, right? This is what it means to fight, flight, or freeze. What James is going to argue this morning is that when we hit our limits, there's actually a 4th way we can handle things. There's actually a 4th way that honors God and honors people. There's a fourth way that loves God and loves people. There's a fourth way that's better than fighting, it's better than running away, and it's better than freezing. There's a fourth way to live life when we hit our limits and we feel like we're stretched to the max. But before we get there, before he teaches us, let's get a little context on where James is in this grand narrative, all right? So James, we talk about how he's straightforward. We've talked about how he's a leader. We've talked about how he's the half-brother of Jesus. But a lot of people don't know how he died. So here's James's life. He is the leader of the church in Jerusalem. As the leader of the church in Jerusalem, he has a lot of influence. Right? Jerusalem is like the headquarters for Christianity. You have people coming from far and wide to be in Jerusalem, see where Jesus walked, sit where Jesus sat. We still do this today, right? And so James is leading this church, but in the city of Jerusalem, it's not just Christians. You have people who don't like Christians there. You have Jewish people who think they're taking the faith in a way that's detrimental, and so they don't want the faith there. You've got other people who are non-believers that just hate that there's any kind of influence that's happening on a religious level. And then also in Jerusalem, they're occupied by the Roman government. And the Romans, they have this really tense relationship with the Christians of their day. And so James is doing his best to lead, doing his best to love people, but all around him, there's tension. All around him, there's people attacking the church. People in his church are losing their jobs. People in his church are losing relationships. People in his church are just going through it. So one day, some men in Jerusalem, they get together and they decide, we've had enough of James. Like, we're done with him. So they get together, they take James, they grab him, walk him up to the Temple Mount, the top of the temple in Jerusalem, and they throw him off. Now, James, for whatever reason, does not die. He's on the ground, he's struggling, he's breathing. And according to tradition, what happens is the men at the bottom of the temple, they decide, well, it's time for us to tag in and do our part. And they start picking up stones and throwing them at James. So now they're trying to kill him by throwing rocks at him. James, I don't know what he ate for breakfast that morning. He's not dying. Okay? Like, he's not giving it up. So finally, there's this one man who has compassion on James. He doesn't save James, but what he does is he decides, we're going to get this over with a little quicker. So he takes a club, hits James over the head, and kills him. All that to say, James understood what it was like to live with a lot of tension. He's writing this letter to the church that's dispersed all around the known world, and he's not writing saying, hey, if we could just be a little better, that would be awesome, or if we could just treat each other a little bit better, that would be great. No, he is writing to them knowing they are stretched to the max. They've hit their limit, they're hitting their capacity, so now here's then how you should live. So here's the fourth way this morning. It's not fight, it's not flight, it's not freeze, but faith is the fourth way. Faith is the fourth way. What James is going to teach us, what he's been teaching us, and what he's going to make really clear this morning is that faith is how we're meant to live. Not just with what we believe in our heads, because that's part of faith, but that's not all of it. Not just what we say with our mouths, because that's part of faith, but that's not all of it. You can say everything in faith that you want to, but if you're not living a life of faith, it doesn't matter. He's saying faith is the way that you and I are supposed to live our lives if we're going to honor God and honor people. Faith is the way we're meant to live our lives if we're going to love God and love other people. Faith is the fourth way. And so here's what we're going to do. We're going to take James chapter 5, verses 7 through 12, and we're going to pull some principles out of it that show us how to live life the fourth way, how to live a life marked by faith. And so if you're taking notes, here's the first thing for you, is that faith looks a lot like patience. Faith looks a lot like patience. Can I be honest with you for a second? I don't like this. Like, I really don't like this. I'm not a very patient person. My wife can attest to that. She's up here raising her hand. Thank you for not raising it sky high, though. That makes me feel a little better. Faith looks a lot like patience. Now, notice what James writes in James chapter 5, verse 7. The first two words he says, be patient. You know what he means by be patient? Be patient. He says, be patient then, brothers and sisters, until the Lord's coming. Is there anything worse when you are stretched to the max than somebody telling you, well, you just need to be patient? I'm like, you just need to get punched in the mouth right now. That sounds really good, right? I'll be patient. I'll hit you slower. How about that? Like, that's what we'll do. It's like slow-mo, kind of like when you're having a dream and you're fighting in your dream and you feel like you're sleeping on your arms because your arms are just like Jell-O, right? Be patient. So James is telling the people in his church, he says, here's what I need you to do. In light of all the conflict, in light of all the stress, in light of all the tension, here's what you need to do. Start by understanding that faith looks a lot like patience. You have to be people who are marked by patience. Now, here's what I'll tell you. Patience is not easy for us because in our day and age, most of us have grown up with this thing called a drive-through, right? So drive-throughs, here's what you get to do. You get to drive in your car, most of us in air conditioning or in heat in the winter. You get to tell them exactly what you want, and if you're my wife, you change everything on the menu to get it exactly how you want it. It's not even the same thing anymore, right? Like, you don't like this restaurant. You like what this restaurant could be if it was made in your image, right? All the husbands understand what I'm talking about, right? So you go through drive-through, you're in the air conditioning, you're listening to what you want to listen to, you are comfortable and cozy, and then you can eat that food on your way to the next thing. You don't even have to wait. You don't have to skip a beat. It is like from one pleasure to the next pleasure to the next thing. And what happens when the drive-through takes a little bit too long? You get frustrated, right? Why do you get frustrated? Because we're impatient. That's just who we are. It's part of our culture now. We are so used to getting things how we want it, when we want it. And here's what's frustrating about patience, according to James, is that patience does not have an expiration date. Patience does not have an expiration date. Notice, how long does James say the people, his brothers and sisters, need to be patient for? Oh, just until Jesus comes back. Like, no big deal. But be patient then until, Tuesday, no. The Lord's coming. Be patient until then. Because for us, what we do is we think, I'm a very patient person. But how many of us, your patience has a limit, right? James is saying, I want you to live with a patience that does not have a limit, that doesn't expire, that doesn't get tired. It's not a matter of how much longer. It's saying, no, patience is meant to be a part of my life for the rest of my life. Until he comes back or until I go to meet him, I'm meant to be patient. So this week I was listening to a podcast from a pastor, and he was talking about his life and just kind of how God had dealt with different things in his life. And this was before he was a pastor. He was newly married, and he married his wife. His wife growing up had been abused every which way you can think of for her entire life. She'd been abused emotionally, verbally, physically, sexually, just had a rough life growing up. They get married, and he says day one in their marriage, she starts then to abuse him. Because we understand, hurt people, right? This is just what we do. So he's not saying that to judge her. He's just saying this was the reality of my marriage from day one. So they kind of try to make things work for a little bit. Eventually, they get to a place where they have to separate, and they end up separating for 27 months. If you can't do the math real quick, that's 2 years and 3 months. That's a long time, right? That's not a stretch in your marriage. That's a pretty big season in your marriage. So for 27 months, they have a couple kids. They're taking the kids back and forth, trying to figure out how to make it work. For 27 months, his wife is working on herself. She's going to counseling. She's trying to be better, struggling. For 27 months, he is wishing he could get divorced, but to him, he felt like the Lord was telling him no. So he didn't get divorced. 27 months of your marriage being in limbo. So one day he talks to a pastor, and the pastor starts asking him a couple of questions. He says, okay, so have you been praying more? And he says, yeah, I've been praying a lot more, Have you been fasting more? Yep, I pray and fast for my family all the time. It's just what I do. I make sure to pray and fast. Are you in the Word more? Right? Are you reading the Bible more? And he says, yep, reading the Bible a lot, really trying to get everything I can from God. And the pastor looks at him and says this. He says, don't despise anything that drags you to the feet of Jesus. Don't despise anything that drags you to the feet of Jesus. He's saying, if it's something that can take you out of your comfort zone and make you realize that you need God's help, it can be a good thing. if it's something that causes you to quit pretending you can do this on your own, it's a good thing. The pain isn't what's great. It's the lesson you can learn in it that matters. He said, don't despise anything that drags you to the feet of Jesus. Now, here's where I struggle with being patient in my faith, if I can be honest. There have been times where I felt like, God, are you even listening? There's been times where I've wondered, okay, God, like you say you hear me, but if you hear me and you're not answering, I'm starting to wonder if you care. There's been times where it feels like, if I'm being real, God's withholding, or maybe at best he's a little slow. Anybody ever feel that way before? You just struggle because you're going, God, I'm doing everything you're telling me to do. And it seems like it's not working. It seems like you're a little slow. But when God talks about himself, he doesn't say he's withholding. When God's word talks about God, it doesn't say he's slow. In fact, it says he's a little better than that. Here's what Peter writes in 2 Peter 3:9. He says, the Lord is not slow. We could stop right there. That's a truth statement that Peter gives us. The Lord is not slow in keeping his promise, as some understand slowness. That's once again being incredibly generous, because here's what it could say. The Lord is not slow in keeping his promise, as almost everyone understands slowness. We've all been frustrated when it seems like God's slow, when it seems like he's withholding, when it seems like he's not answering, and yet Peter's saying, no, he's not slow. Instead, he's patient with you. So what we consider slowness, God knows is patience. What we think is God withholding is God saying, no, I'm actually working in ways that you don't fully understand, that you can't fully see, because we process everything in very limited short terms. We want God to fix it now, or maybe at best, like God, I might be able to give you like a week or 3 or 4 weeks. But God doesn't process anything in our life through the lens of a day or a week or a month. He processes through eternity. So he's not slow in keeping his promise. Instead, he's patient with you, not wanting anyone to perish, but everyone to come to repentance. God isn't slow. He's just doing things the way that he knows is best, even when it doesn't fully make sense to you and me. This is where we have to, in patience, realize that God knows what he's doing, but also understand that our need for patience is a constant reminder that life isn't just about me. Our need for patience is a constant reminder that life isn't just about me. The problem we have in our day and age is even when we read something like the Bible, you know who just like real easily and subtly comes in and becomes the hero of the story? Us. We start reading things and we're like, you know what? I am going to overcome. I am going to be great. I am going to be the one that makes this happen. And yet there's only one hero in the story. And it's not us. It's God. See, God does things in ways we don't fully understand, and we have to learn to be okay with that. We have to learn to say, you know what, if God is God, I can't then second guess everything he does. I have to understand that life isn't just about me. It's actually about him. And I play a part of that story, but the story is not about me. Notice what James continues with in the second half of verse 7 and also in verse 8. He says, see how the farmer waits for the land to yield its valuable crop, patiently waiting for the autumn and spring rains. You too, be patient and stand firm, because the Lord's coming is near. How many times is he going to tell us to be patient? And yet he continues, because he says, hey, here's what I want you to do. I want you to be patient and understand that you're meant to imitate the farmer. Now, I'm not a farmer. Most of us in here, we're not farmers, right? In fact, I have the opposite of a green thumb, whatever that is. All this rain has been awesome for our little garden outside our house, because without it, we killing that thing, okay? But here's what happens with farming. You can do all the right things, and the crop still might not pop. You can do everything you're supposed to do, but there are some things, even with farming, that are totally outside of your control, right? So why does he mention the farmer? It's because the farmer's job, you do everything you're supposed to do, and then wait. You do everything with integrity, and then pause. Your job and my job is to patiently wait, to say, I'm going to look to God to trust that he's working in ways that I don't fully see. He's doing things that I might not completely understand, and that's okay, because my job is to live a life of faith, and faith often looks like patience, which takes us to our second thing we're going to learn from Pastor James here in James chapter 5, and it's that faith refuses to grumble. Faith refuses to grumble. Now, that word grumble, we don't use very often, right? So here's what we could say. Faith refuses to complain. Faith refuses to whine about it. Faith refuses to subtly drop the hint so that everyone knows that you're right and someone else is wrong. Faith refuses to be that guy or that girl that every time you get around them, you know, what are they going to complain about now, right? Faith refuses to grumble. Now, once again, can I be honest with you? I'm a really good complainer. Like, I'm real good at it. Like, it does not take much for me to start complaining. I can tend to be cynical. I can tend to be a little negative, especially when I get tired, right? I can complain pretty easily. In fact, this week, I was prepping this sermon. I was working on this point in the sermon, and I walked down the hallway over here, over to this meeting room that's to my left and your right, and I was like, I just need a little bit of caffeine. I'm going to make a cup of coffee. We got a Keurig back there. So you know what I did? I walked up, hit the button for it to power on, and this little light pops up that says, heating up. I stand there, that little light, guess what it still says? Heating up. Standing there a little bit longer. Light's not changing. It's still saying heating up. And this isn't like some of those Keurigs where like you can hear the water like really getting hot. It just says heating up. Now, it felt like it had been minutes. I'm going to tell you it had probably been about 30 seconds. But as I'm standing there, I'm looking at it saying heating up, and I want to throw it because what I'm thinking is, I could have made a pot of coffee faster than this. You're supposed to be the faster option. Let's go. I can still hear the worship music in my office playing as I'm complaining, writing a sermon about not complaining. Here's the thing. When we hit our limit, when we are stretched to the max, when we feel like our capacity has been met, we become very, very good at complaining. We get very good at pointing out the faults of others. We become professional finger pointers to say, I wouldn't do that. That's not a good choice. Can you believe they said that? Can you believe they painted that wall that color? What's wrong with them? Are they stupid, right? Like, we just get really good at complaining about other people. And normally, just a heads up, this is a timeout for you. If you're ever around somebody who's like really good at complaining all the time, that says more about them than it does about other people, right? But faith refuses to grumble. Faith isn't willing to be the one to complain about everything all the time. But here's what we know is true about stress, is that when you get stressed out by something outside of you, it creates stress within you, right? When you're dealing with trouble at work or trouble with a friend or trouble in your bank account, trouble anywhere, guess what? You start bleeding on people that didn't cut you. You start being a worse husband, worse wife. You start struggling to be a healthy person for your kids and for your friends, for your church family. I had a situation years ago as a leader at a church, and I thought I was handling it really, really well, really messy situation. Had been handling it for like a month. Well, about a month in, I start hearing that like the people in this thing are just making stuff up about me, misrepresenting truth about my wife, and I can handle it with me. You drag my wife into it, then I really get good at complaining, right? And I get really angry. And I remember thinking, I was handling it really well on the outside. I had people telling me, man, you're doing such a good job with this. You're handling it well. And I started to agree. Till one day, I'm upstairs in my house, because in my house, upstairs is where all the bedrooms are in the bathroom. And Katie's in the bathroom. She's getting ready. And I'm standing there talking to her about this situation. And have you ever been talking and then all of a sudden realized, oh, no, I'm not talking. I'm screaming right now. That was me. Like, I realized I'm not yelling at my wife, but I'm definitely yelling to her. And I'm like losing it. And it's like this moment where I realized what I was doing. I had to stop, and I apologized to her. See, what happens with stress and with hitting your limits is that when you hit that limit, you start bleeding on people who don't cut you. You start hurting people who didn't hurt you. You get this tension that's created in your relationships. And when James is writing to the church in Jerusalem, he's writing to people who are dealing with things they've never had to deal with before. He's writing to people who the stress of how everybody outside the church is affecting them is now beginning to affect their relationship with one another. So James gives this really practical advice here, really more of a command in verse 9. Here's what he says. He says, don't grumble against one another. Don't finger point at one another. Don't complain about one another. And notice what he follows that up with. He says, brothers and sisters. Over and over again in these 5 verses of Scripture, James is going to remind us, he's not writing this to just anybody, but he's writing this to people who are in the church. Because honestly, when culture's falling apart, like, yes, that's our responsibility. We want to do something about that, but that's not our problem. Our problem is when the culture of this place becomes toxic. When we're so stressed by the things happening outside of here that the relationships inside of here start getting affected. When we start pointing the finger and judging one another, he says, don't grumble against one another, brothers and sisters, or you will be judged. In other words, Jesus tells us, the measure with which you judge, you too will be what? Judged. He's saying you have to be really, really careful because the judge, capital J, that being Jesus, is standing at the door. There's only one judge, and it's not me. There's only one real judge, and it's not you. The only judge that is fit to actually judge is Jesus himself. So here's the caution that James is trying to get to in this verse, is don't let the stress of life cause you to become a critic. Don't let the stress of life cause you to become a critic. It is so easy when we're hurting for us to criticize other people. Some of us do it because it makes us feel better about ourselves and about our situation. Some of us do it because you're naturally really good at it. But whatever it is, we can't let the stress of life cause us to become critical of other people and cause us to be critics about everyone and everything around us, including inside the church. We have to protect ourselves from that. So James gives an example in the next verse, verse 10, where he says, hey, I want you to make sure you don't become a critic. So here's people I want you to look at. He says in verse 10, brothers and sisters, as an example of patience in the face of suffering, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. In other words, James is saying, if you want to do this the right way, here's who you need to look to, the prophets. You need to look to people like Isaiah, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, Daniel. You need to look in other places of Scripture. It's going to say, look to the apostles like Paul and like Peter. People who went through it in life, but they didn't allow it to change their life. They didn't allow it to make themselves become critical of others. No, they kept serving God, because they knew the way to serve God was to serve others. The way to love God meant that you also loved other people. See, if we're going to be careful about not letting the stress of life to make us become a critic, we also have to make sure that our suffering doesn't become selfishness. Did you ever notice, like, when you're in pain? Let's just talk physical pain for a second. If you've ever had surgery, right, or you're really sick, and you're laying in bed, how easily can you think of ways that somebody could have served you better when you're not feeling good? Like, you start thinking to yourself, well, if she was sick, she'd already have some soup and crackers up here right now. Or, oh, I can't believe more people haven't texted me to reach out to make sure I'm okay. I can't imagine why so-and-so wouldn't call me yet. It could be because you're just terrible to deal with. But when you're hurting, it's so easy to think, man, other people should do more for me. It's easy when we're hurting for us to become about ourselves. And yet he points to the prophets to say, hey, these are people who we consider heroes, but they were often misunderstood in their day. They were often misunderstood to the point of people wanting them dead. We have to look to them. But then he gives us another example in verse 11. It's the example of Job. He says, as you know, we count as blessed those who have persevered. You have heard of Job's perseverance and have seen what the Lord finally brought about. And here's what the Lord brought about. The Lord is full of compassion and mercy. The Lord is full of compassion and mercy. Now, we're not going to go through Job's entire story just for the sake of time, because I'm sure you want to eat lunch in a little while, right? But Job in the Old Testament, I'd encourage you. I see people shaking their head like, yeah, we want to eat lunch. I got you. Job in the Old Testament loses almost everything. And yet, in the midst of losing almost everything, he doesn't give up on God. He sticks by God. He doesn't do it perfectly. He doesn't say everything the right way. He's going to lose his friends. He's going to lose some of his wealth. He's going to lose his health. But he doesn't lose God, because in the midst of his pain, he learned that God is full of compassion and mercy. So there are some things we never learn when we want it to be easy. And there are some things we never learn when we're focused on complaining and grumbling. The sound of our grumbling can drown out the lesson God wants us to learn. He's saying, I want you to make sure you're not constantly asking, why me, God? And start asking questions like, God, what can I get out of this? What can I learn here? What can I take away from this that's going to change me for the long term? We have to make sure our suffering doesn't become selfishness, which takes us to our third and final thing that James is going to teach us this morning, and it's that faith builds a better culture. Faith builds a better culture. Now, culture is that thing. You can say the right thing all you want, but culture is what people experience when they experience you. You ever been to somebody's house and they're like super welcoming, love the fact that you're there, they're prepared for you, they're ready for you? How good does that feel? Right? That's the culture of their home. Then you go to other people's homes and it's like, did you forget I was coming over? Right? Like they're still trying to tidy up around you a little bit. They're like clearly made dinner for 3 and you've got 4 in your family and you're like, can't wait to have that edge of chicken, right? That's going to be awesome. Honestly, sometimes that's a mishap, and sometimes that's just the culture of somebody's home, right? Culture is what you experience or what people experience when they experience you. And here's what James is saying. The culture of the church needs to be fantastic. The culture of people who say they believe in Jesus needs to be a cut above. It just simply, without any pride, needs to be better. When people experience life with someone who would claim to be a part of the church, they need to realize, man, there's something different about these people. I don't believe what they believe, but I want what they got. I don't agree with everything they say, but I can't deny the effectiveness of what they believe. Right? We're meant to be a better experience than what they get anywhere else, because the local church is the hope of the world. The local church is the hope of the world. Now, you might disagree with that, right? Some people get really theological and they say, well, Jesus is the hope of the world. Yeah, Jesus is the hope of the world. Guess who Jesus chooses to marry? He calls the church his bride. You're like, well, that's the global church. Yeah, but do you know how a global church expresses itself? Incredibly locally, right? Like you ain't attending church in India this morning, right? But you're still a part of the Big C church, right? You go local. When God decided to put on skin and come down and live life with us, he got very local. And his church is meant to do the same thing. We're meant to be here expressing hope, living life a different way in front of people that shows them, man, this is what life could be like. So in James chapter 5, verse 12, James is going to have this verse that, if I'm being honest, the first time you read it, it doesn't seem like it fits in with the rest of these scriptures we just read. In fact, a lot of commentators, when you study this verse, they're going to tell you that, hey, there's a good chance these verses are just like a tag to the rest of this. It's almost like a post-credit scene. It's setting up something different. It's going somewhere different. It's just there, and we couldn't figure out where to put it anywhere else, right? This is just a tag. But notice how he starts the verse. He starts with 2 words. He says, above all. Above all. In other words, this isn't new. This is what James has been building towards. He's been strategically trying to get to this point in his writing. So he says, above all, my brothers and sisters, do not swear, not by heaven or by earth or by anything else. All you need to say is a simple yes or no. Otherwise, you will be condemned. Now, that sounds kind of harsh, right? Like if I say yes, I'm good, but if I swear an oath by God, then I'm condemned. And we can focus a lot on the practicality of that and what you should and shouldn't say, but the heart of this is a little bit different. So in James's day, people would swear an oath one of 2 ways. The first way was they would swear an oath and they would say, by God or by heaven. So they were appealing to someone and something higher than themselves. And that's when you knew the oath really meant something. But it was also common practice for you just to give a simple yes or a simple no. And when you did that, that was the equivalent of crossing your fingers and putting it behind your back. So in other words, what James is saying is it was totally normal in his day for people to not be able to trust what you say. It was completely accepted practice for people to not have integrity. And what James is saying, once again, writing to the brothers and sisters, he's not writing to everybody, he's writing to the church. He's saying you should be a community of integrity to the point that when you say yes, you mean yes. When you give a gracious no, you mean no. Our culture, as followers of Jesus Christ, is meant to be different. It's meant to be better. It's meant to stand out. When everybody else lets go of their word, we hold on fast. When everybody else is willing to cut corners, we don't cut corners. When everybody else is willing to do it kind of sort of in a good way, no, we're going to do this thing all the way. He's saying you should be different. Such a person of integrity that your yes means yes, and your no means no. When people experience Christians today, what do they walk away with? If we're being honest, studies in the past 10 years are going to show us most people, when they interact, non-Christians, when they interact with Christians, they walk away feeling like Christians are two things: irrelevant and extreme. But for those of us inside, let's be honest, is there anything more relevant to our lives than Jesus Christ? No. But that's not what people experience. So this, even though it was written 2,000 years ago, this is a challenge for us here today. To say, you know what? We want to build a better culture. We want our faith to infect every single thing we do. We want our faith to have an impact on every single person we meet. This is why weeks like this week, where we're going to go out for Love Week, guys, we're gonna work really hard on some projects. I am gonna sweat a ton, okay? Like if I eat well this week, I'm gonna lose some good weight, all right? That's the goal, right? I'm just gonna figure this thing out. We're gonna go at it, all right? But what's gonna happen is people are gonna see that, and when they see that, hopefully what they see is, man, these are people who get it. Don't agree with everything they believe, but I want what they have. So you and I, we're meant to be the ultimate example of life to the full. We're meant to be the ultimate example of life to the full. So that when Jesus says 2,000 years ago that you are the light of the world, that's written for us. You are the salt of the earth. That's for us. You're a city on a hill that cannot be hidden. Notice this, the world notices us when we're at our best and we're at our worst. So what presentation are we going to give them? Faith builds a better culture. Faith does that by being patient. Faith does that by not grumbling and not complaining. Faith does that by being a cut above, not in pride, but in humility. To say, in light of what God's done for me, here's how I'm going to then live for him. Faith is the better way that we're called to live. I'm going to ask you, if you will, just where you are. If you're online, you can do this as well. Would you just bow your head and close your eyes? And this, once again, is just an opportunity for us to eliminate some distraction and really give some space for God to speak to us. For some of you in here, you're hearing about this fourth way. You're hearing about the way of faith. And if you're just being honest, what you've been confronted with this morning is that you're not living a life of faith because you don't have a relationship with Jesus. Today's the day where that can change for you. Today's the day you can begin not living a life that's marked by fight, flight, or freeze. You don't have to act like nothing's wrong. You don't have to fight your way through life. You don't have to run away from things, but you can actually approach the rest of your life with integrity and humility and say, I don't have it all together, but God's going to make the best of my life. If you're in here this morning and you say, man, I want to start a relationship with Jesus. I want to give him control of my life. Would you just raise your hand for just a moment? For just a moment. That's awesome. You can put it right back down. That's great. For others of us in here, my hope today is that this word challenges you the way that it challenged me even as I was preparing it. That we would take this ancient text, these ancient words, and understand how much it applies to us here and now. If we're going to experience the revival that we sang about this morning, it doesn't happen because the world gets right. It happens because we get right. It happens because we're being renewed personally. So this morning, if God in his grace has started to show you anything that needs to change, man, let's have the courage to change that thing. Jesus, I thank you for today. I thank you that you are speaking to us, that you are making yourself known loud and clear. I thank you for those that responded to start a relationship with you, that want to live life with you, want to walk alongside you. God, I pray that we as a church would help them get started off in a strong way. God, for others of us in here, I pray that whatever you've challenged us with, we will step up to that challenge. That we will trust you more than we trust ourselves. And we will be people marked by faith, marked by patience, marked by better words and better timing, marked by a better culture that when people look at us, they go, man, this is so different. This is so incredible. And they understand their need to change as well. Jesus, thank you for speaking to us. It's in Jesus' name we pray.